Hi, welcome. You're listening to Claim in Space. I'm your host, Vikram. In this episode, we'll be talking to Jean Deville. Jean is the founder of China Aerospace Blog, which chronicles the Chinese space ecosystem. It's a very informative blog if you need to know all things about space in China, objectively. By day, he works for Business France. In this episode, we'll be talking to Jean about China Aerospace Blog and what are his thoughts about the ecosystem in China, sizing the market, how the government is involved, and much, much more. So let's get started. Welcome to the show. So before we get started, I was wondering, could you introduce yourself to the audience? Where did you start? How did you get to where you are today?
Hi Vikram, it's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm Jean Deville, and I'm currently based in Shenzhen in China. I'm the founder of China Aerospace Blog, which is a blog focused on bridging the gap in information there is out there about aviation and space industries in China. And well, a little background about myself. I've been working about 2 years now in China on this topic. Before, I was also working in an aerospace consultancy back in Toulouse. And overall, a lot of my work has been very China-focused. So, yeah, that's about it. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks. Really glad to have you on board. So, what got you started with the China Aerospace Blog? Like, what was it, and what's its objective?
As I mentioned earlier, the main objective is to bridge the gap in information about Chinese aviation and space industries, because a lot of the information I feel out there is very U.S., European, and Russian space-centric. You have a lot of information on these three countries, areas, and China is sort of a gray area, I feel, where information is sparse, and even when you do find information on it, a lot of it can be a little political. There are a lot of hawkish viewpoints out there on the Chinese industry, which is not necessarily it's not necessarily unfounded, but it's just one side of the story. Yeah. So the whole objective of China Aerospace Blog is to try to bring that information, and not necessarily day-to-day information, because there are quite a few people on Twitter who do that pretty well, but it's more analyzing the Chinese space industry in depth, and basically basing myself on a set of data, and always from an objective point of view.
Yep. Okay, cool. Yeah. I think some of us outside of China can definitely be grateful for that blog. So, because we can get like a different picture of what the aerospace industry is like in China. I know I'm one of them. So when it comes to like Chinese aerospace, how is the market structured? Like how, what is the size? How big is it? How does it happen in China? The big picture, yes.
Well, there are estimations today on the size of the Chinese space industry. The only issue is these are only estimations, and I don't know if they're reliable. I think because part of it is military. It's within the military budget, so it's very hard to estimate how big it is. I think it's easier to understand and to comprehend through the achievements that the Chinese have realized in space, which we can talk about, of course, in further questions. Yeah. So I'd say an overall picture of how it's structured. What listeners must know is that most of the Chinese space industry is state-owned. So basically, you have multiple ministries out there that take part in the Chinese space activities. Yep. So the biggest one would be the MIIT, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, which plays a role in the administration of the two main contractors of the Chinese space program, which are CASC and CASIC. So CASC is China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation. CASIC is a similar acronym. And each of these contractors have a number of academies. So for CAST, for example, the most famous ones would be, for example, CAST, which manufactures satellites, CALT, which makes rockets and so on.
Yeah.
And each of these academies have a number of institute and enterprises. And so you sort of feel how it can get more and more complicated. And what makes it even more complicated is within these institutes and academies, you also have other activities. You have automobile, you have real estate, you have consumer products, you have all this.
Yeah.
And the fact that also the names given are not necessarily very easy to remember. Sometimes it's just numbers, it's like number 1 academy, number 5 academy, number 2 institute. And, both Cass and Kazakh, for example, can have a number 5 institute. So it's easy to get them mixed up.
Yeah.
So that would be MIIT. You also have other ministries which have activities in space. You also have the China Academy of Sciences, which is, I'd say, a ministry level research institute in China. They're in space systems manufacturing. And so you have all that. Yeah. And on top of that, you have to add also a layer of, private startups that are growing and that have been enabled since 2014. So it's all that constitutes.
And from what I gather, most of those private are actually ex-government employees, I think, right? They used to work with the Chinese Space Agency in one of those departments, and there's a technology transfer going. Is that true, or?
I think that in terms of human resources, you're absolutely right. Before 2014, 99.9% of all the people working in space were within these 2 big contractors and also some of the other institutes and other ministries. So everything was state-owned. And when I'd say private startups were allowed to happen, the human resources that were there, the founders, a lot of them came from these space industries, state-owned space industries. And one of the reasons, of course, is there's a lot of private capital pouring to there. Our salaries aren't necessarily very high in these state-owned companies. So most of the resources come from state-owned companies, but that doesn't mean that all startups are linked to space-owned companies. That is what sometimes you see in the press and on Twitter. And the thing is, I think before saying that's a pretty extreme view, and I think before saying that, it could be true, but I think we have to prove it. Yeah. And that's also something I've been trying to do in China Aerospace Blog, which is looking at who are the investors backing these startups and how they work with these state-owned companies.
Okay. I think my next question was going to be the main players, but you've answered that and how the government is involved. And what are kind of the challenges, I guess, for the Chinese space ecosystem at the moment, like in terms of both public and private entities? Within China and as per their place in the global space ecosystem?
Well, I'd say that there's a challenge for the Chinese industry that's been going on for maybe I'd say 20 to 30 years. It is there are American restrictions on exporting space systems and space components to the Chinese. So there's a list there's a regulation called ITAR, and what happens is that Chinese launchers, for example, cannot launch foreign satellites that have American components in them, which is, I'd say, a great majority of the satellites out there. So there's that. And when last year, China was the first country worldwide in terms of number of launches. And when you look at the satellites they've been launching, most of them are just Chinese satellites because they're not allowed to launch foreign satellites, even though there are some exceptions to what I'm saying. So I'd say that's one of the biggest challenges is that the industry is getting big, very big in China, but it's very China focused. And definitely going abroad and getting more international is very important. And so that's the challenge, of course, for the state-owned contractors. But then I'd say they're also supported by the state. So, I mean, if they don't get the contracts, it's not, they're not going to close down. But for the private sector, that's a much bigger problem because I'd say there is sort of a bubble going on in the private sector right now. You have, for example, 10 to 15 launcher companies have been created, and in light launchers, and there's no market out there for 10 to 15 launchers. They have to go abroad to get contracts abroad, and it's sort of launch or die.
Yeah, it's interesting to say about the launches, because we did like a bit of business intelligence and found that even though the US is the biggest market for space, most of the launches happening just last year were all in the Asia Pacific region. It was China, India, Japan, and New Zealand. So it's like the stock market, like the US is the biggest stock market, but most of the business transactions that happen are in the Asia Pacific more than, so it's interesting to see that happen. I guess China would have to look internationally to keep up with those launches. Okay, so I guess how would you sort of compare, I guess, China's space endeavors to other Asian nations? I guess I already mentioned some of them, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, usually the comparison is done with Japan and India, because they're sort of the competing superpowers in the Asia Pacific region, and including they've all tried to send probes to Mars. They're all looking at the moon, and Japan's been in this industry for maybe for space exploration for longer than China and India. But the difference, I think, is that China is really present on all fronts. I think their space projects are much more diversified. They're in human space flight, they're in space exploration. They have a varied set of launcher vehicles compared to two other countries mentioned. India, for example, also has an ambitious space program. They are trying to increase the payload of their heavy launchers. They have the Mars orbiter. But I think China is more comparable with the U.S. Through their plans for the Chinese space station. Their plans for Mars, for Jupiter, and for visiting asteroids. And they also have this booming new space sector, which really reminds us of what's going on in the U.S. So, that's more comparable to the U.S., I'd say, even though there is regional competition. Absolutely.
So I guess from the perspective of being in China, is there a sense of urgency and competition with, from either the government or private with other sort of governments? Is there the whole space race that happened from a government point, or is it more of a private space race, or is it both? From the Chinese perspective, is there pressure for that kind of stuff over there?
Well, I think the Chinese projects in space have a political goal. It sort of unites the Chinese people around these very visible projects. So there's that. And I'd say with foreign countries, I'd say it's mostly with the US and especially SpaceX. Whenever you see a piece of news about Chinese new space, they're always comparing themselves to SpaceX. Who is the next Elon Musk? Is this the Chinese Elon Musk? And so it's all that going around, more than just comparing themselves to America, although that definitely happens a lot. It's comparing themselves to SpaceX. And I think other countries like, Russia, Japan, and, just the EU in general, we actually don't hear that much about them in the Chinese media. It's mostly US focused.
Okay, so they have they sort of are trying to compete with the US more than anyone else.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I guess how is the Chinese Space Agency involved with the local sort of ecosystem, and what are their sort of strategic focuses or foci for the next 5 years and longer?
Well, I'd say there's the private sector, there's the public sector. The private sector is to grow and to survive and to raise further rounds of capital. Right now, I'd say all of these Chinese private startups are very early stage. So it is to, who's going to launch the first rocket, who's going to get, secure the first commercial contracts, who's going to raise more funds, and who's going to get there first, because it's going to be a bloody battleground in the private sector.
Imagine.
So there's that, and in the public sector, well, there's a lot of very ambitious projects. There's of course the human spaceflight projects. Over the past 15 years, the Chinese have launched their first astronauts in 2003. They've had extravehicular activity, space rendezvous. They've also had experimental space stations with Tiangong 1 and 2. Yeah. So that's already really impressive. And their next move is, this year, perhaps in July, they will launch their Long March 5, which is planned to launch parts of the future Chinese space station. Yep. They're also developing their next generation crewed spacecraft, which is meant to replace Shenzhou. Shenzhou is the sort of equivalent of Soyuz, the Soyuz capsule in Russia. Yeah. And they also have, and that was very visible this year in January, the Chinese lunar exploration program with Chang'e 4, which landed a rover on the moon. So, these moon missions are going to continue with Chang'e 5, 6, 7, 8, and in the end, a crewed mission to Mars, which is right now planned at around, I'd say 2030 at the earliest. Right. So there's that. And there are also other projects. There are many. There's a mission to to visit an asteroid that was announced a few days ago. There's more on Jupiter. There are space telescopes.
So it's sort of like the US, where all the I guess the exploration aspects are focused by the agency, while all the lower Earth orbit aspects are focused for the commercial market. Because that's what the US, I think, that at least that's from NASA's perspective. They want to make sure that everything in LEO is for the commercial private markets, while NASA focuses on space exploration and research, etc. But obviously that's not always the case with, example, Mars and Moon. So is that sort of similar? That's what I'm sort of getting at.
I think it's a bit different. There are a lot of differences similarities as well, but between China and the US. For example, you have a lot of billionaires in the US supporting space industry, less so in China. Yeah. And it's mostly just private capital supporting these new space startups. And I think the new space companies in in the US are a lot more advanced. Like, for example, SpaceX, they're sending literally payload to LEO, to geostationary orbits. It goes beyond that. And when you look at all the launcher companies and even satellite companies, new space companies in China, it's just low Earth orbit. It's small satellites, it's CubeSats. Yeah. And they're still under development. So I'd say in China, the state is still covering the majority of all the space landscape, and I'd say new space is just nibbling a little bit the SpaceX and the LEO part, but just nibbling.
And how much I guess private capital has gone into like the new space aspects so far in China?
Unfortunately I have that figure written somewhere. I don't remember it just now, but it's definitely growing very fast. Yeah. It's I'd say one of the top 3 or 4 countries in terms of raising capital in the last 15 years, and that's very impressive because this has only been allowed for the last 5 years. So just what they raised in 5 years puts them on par with what other countries with what they raised over 15 years. Yeah. So there's that, and
because I remember from 2014 it was 0 companies, and then I think 2018 there were 80 companies or something, new companies. Am I right about that? Or or somewhat? Yeah.
Yes, I'd say 80 companies is a good estimation. It depends on what you call a new space startup, of course.
Yeah. I mean, there's a broad category.
I guess it goes from between 50 to 60 if you're really restrictive on the definition to maybe 100.
Okay, I see. Okay. Awesome. So I guess is there is there something you could recommend, like a book for our listeners that could tell us more about China related to space, or if not, something related to Chinese society, politics, economics, policy, or culture?
Yes. There's
it could be obviously apart from your blog. Is there something? Is there something?
Of course. So I think one of the classics, I think if you're interested in China, everyone must read China in Space, written by Brian Harvey. It dates back to 2012 and 2013. So some of the information is a bit old, especially regarding the private sector. There was literally no new space back then.
Yeah.
But the general idea and the structure of all the public sector is definitely very accurate and very, I'd say, complete in this book. So that's top one. Okay. And in terms of just daily reads, I think, well, of course, there's China Aerospace Blog.
Yeah.
There's Go Taikonauts, that's very good as well.
Yep.
And that's more day-to-day news. And they also have a very interesting newsletter on Chinese space.
Yeah.
And other than that, that's also something I mentioned in the beginning. There's not that much, specialized media on China. So I'd say it's more Twitter, following some people like Andrew Jones on Twitter, people who tweet a lot about China. You have that on social media or LinkedIn.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, cool. So before we conclude, if listeners want to reach out to you, where can they find you on the internet?
They can send me an email. I can leave my email after. Or they can just directly connect with me on LinkedIn. I also post a lot on Twitter. So both those social media platforms are fine.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So thank you for taking time to be here. So that was Jean Deville, the founder of the China Aerospace Blog, talking to us about the Chinese space ecosystem.
Thank you all for tuning into Claiming Space. If you're new to the show, then I suggest starting out at our launch episode, which is a couple of minutes long, and the first episode on identity. If you want to find out more, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and at www.claiming.space. That's CLAYMING.space. Don't forget to share the episode with your friends, rate and review us on iTunes. It really helps people find the show and grow the audience. Until next time, bye!